Hey guys, welcome to Chinese Stories. Tonight we're kicking things off with a tale that starts in a tea house, echoes through palaces, and ends in a haunting silence. You're about to meet a man who once loaned money to the empire, dined with warlords, and wore a red-topped hat that marked him as a businessman, elevated to official rank, an almost impossible dream in imperial China. But his journey didn't start with silk robes or silver coins. It began with ink-stained fingers, ledgers, and a sharp tongue. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It was the late Qing Dynasty, around the 1852, a time when China was bruised by foreign invasions, internal rebellions, and a deeply confused court. While emperors ruled behind curtains and eunuchs whispered in corridors, far from Beijing, a young man in Hangzhou was just trying to make a living. His name, Xueyan. Not born into wealth, not a child of scholars or warriors, just another street-smart clerk working in a local silk and tea shop. But this guy had something that couldn't be bought or taught. Survival instincts and the gift of knowing exactly what people wanted to hear. Xueyan wasn't flashy at first. He was the kind who listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, it hit the mark. He understood what made merchants nervous, what made officials tick, and what flattered customers without sounding desperate. These small things made big ripples. Before long, his bosses noticed. He was promoted. Then again. But here's the twist. Xueyan didn't just want to be rich, he wanted access. He understood that in Qing China, money wasn't enough. What you needed was official favor. Without it, your silver could vanish overnight. Your shop could be sealed with a single imperial order. So he did something most businessmen wouldn't dare. He found ways to help government officials, especially when they were short on money. Because trust me, even warlords had cash flow problems. One of those officials was a rising star named Zongtang. At the time, China was being ripped apart by the Taiping Rebellion, a massive civil war that killed millions. The Qing government was so broke, it was basically crowdfunding its military. This is where Xueyan saw his opening. He used his business network to raise funds, buy supplies, and quietly became the man behind the curtain for many military operations. Soldiers marched with weapons bought on Xueyan's credit. Leftover rice from his warehouses fed entire armies. You could say he was a one-man logistics department for the empire. As his influence grew, people started to notice his signature look, always dressed in fine but modest robes, capped with that iconic red-topped hat, signaling that he held a civil rank. That hat wasn't just decoration, it meant access to the court, to imperial protection, and most dangerously to the political chessboard of the Qing dynasty. But success in imperial China was a delicate dance. For Xueyan, every step forward was made on the floor of cracking ice. He wasn't just building wealth. He was stepping into a world where alliances changed with the wind, and a whispered word could ruin a man. Still, at this stage, he seemed untouchable. He had the money, he had the favors, he had the right friends. Or so he thought. This first chapter of Xueyan's journey isn't just a rags to riches story. It's about how ambition, when paired with timing and talent, can lift a man from obscurity to power. But It also sets the stage for the deeper, darker question. When you're dancing this close to emperors and generals, what happens when the music stops? By the 1,860 seconds, Hu Xueyan was no longer just a clever clerk who made it big. He was the man officials called when they had a crisis that needed solving quietly. And nobody needed more help than his old friend turned patron, Zongtang. Now, Zuo wasn't your average Qing general. He was a tough, bookish, no-nonsense guy who believed in saving the empire by building it back up with his own hands. Schools, agriculture, armies, the whole package. But dreams like that cost money. Lots of it. And guess who was there to write the checks? That's right, Hu Xueyan. It was a strange partnership on paper. One man commanded armies, the other sold silk and lent money. But together, they were like a two-man rescue squad for a dying dynasty. When the Qing court wouldn't give Zongtang enough funds to campaign in the northwest, it was Hu Xueyan who secured grain shipments and floated loans. Not through official treasuries, but through his own network of banks, merchants, and warehouses. He even founded the first Chinese-run modern bank called Fukun Yinhang. That wasn't just a vanity project. It was a financial weapon designed to give China's provinces some independence from foreign lenders who were circling like sharks after the Opium Wars. Hu Xueyan's bank provided credit to the military, to farmers, and to merchants who couldn't afford the high-interest loans from British or French banks. It was the economic version of fighting back. But here's where it starts to get complicated. The more Hu Xueyan helped Zongtang, the more deeply he tied himself to one political camp. And in Qing Dynasty politics, camps were dangerous. Because where you stood said everything about what you believed and who wanted to see you fall. Enter the Empress Dowager, Cixi Taihou, the most powerful woman in China, maybe in the world at that time. She ruled behind a screen, literally giving orders from behind silk curtains, while puppet emperors mouthed her words. And while she had her moments of brilliance, Cixi wasn't exactly a fan of reformers like Zongtang, who believed China needed to modernize in order to survive. To her, reform meant trouble. Reformers asked too many questions, spent too much money, and challenged the delicate hierarchy that kept her in control. So even though Hu Xueyan wasn't giving political speeches or writing manifestos, his financial lifeline to reformist causes put a big glowing target on his back. Still, Hu Xueyan didn't flinch. In fact, he expanded his operations, opened silk factories, sponsored new tech, and even built a modern pharmacy network to challenge Western medicine. He wasn't just bankrolling the state anymore. He was trying to reshape society. And society, for a while, loved him for it. Farmers respected him. Students quoted him. Businessmen toasted to him. Even foreign diplomats were curious about this Chinese Rockefeller who managed to stand toe-to-toe with Qing officials and Western bankers. But popularity is a double-edged sword, because while Hu Xueyan was out winning hearts, others were sharpening knives. His rivals, especially the ones close to Cixi, began to whisper, "He's getting too big. He's just a merchant. What right does he have to hold civil rank?" Maybe he's using his bank to build his own power base. These weren't random gossip. They were calculated leaks, the kind that seeded doubt inside the palace. And remember that red-topped hat? The one that signaled his civil title? In the eyes of jealous officials, it wasn't a badge of honor anymore. It was a symbol of a boundary crossed a merchant daring to play in the world of mandarins. That didn't sit well with the elite. Still, Xueyan carried on. He didn't see the whispers. Or maybe he chose not to. Maybe he thought his work spoke for itself. After all, wasn't he holding up half the empire's economy? But the higher you rise, the more obvious you become. And in a system that thrives on hierarchy and suspicion, being useful only buys you time. The real question lingering in the corridors of power wasn't how Xueyan made his fortune. It was why a man like him was allowed to keep it. If Xueyan had stopped there just managing banks, funding generals, and quietly building a commercial empire, maybe he could have slipped into old age with a fortune and a peaceful garden. But that's not how things worked in the late Qing dynasty. Once you were in the game, the only way out was either with honors or disgrace. By the early 1872s, the political atmosphere in Beijing had become thick with paranoia. Reformers like Zongtang were still pushing to modernize China's industries and strengthen the military. But every cannon purchased, every school built, every new railway planned all looked like a challenge to the old order. And right at the financial heart of it all was our red-top merchant, Xueyan. Now here's where it gets juicy. While Zongtang was battling in the northwest to suppress Muslim uprisings and reclaim lost territory, Xueyan was acting as his quartermaster, banker, and the PR manager all rolled into one. The military couldn't function without Hu's support. He paid soldiers. He secured supplies. He even funded the construction of an arsenal in Fuzhou to build Western-style ships. But back in the capital, another name had been rising, Li Hongzhang. Now, Li wasn't exactly Xueyan's nemesis at first, but their paths were heading toward a collision. Li also believed in strengthening China, but his methods and, more importantly, his political alliances were different. He leaned more toward foreign cooperation, especially with the British. He also had Cixi Taiho's ear, which, let's be honest, mattered more than any number of cannons. To Li and his circle, Xueyan was becoming a problem. He was too close to Zongtang, too independent, too rich, and too inconvenient. Unlike Li's own financial backers, who were mostly foreign banks and merchants, Hu represented a kind of homegrown alternative. And when power is a pie, there's only so much to go around. So began the slow and quiet campaign to isolate him. Officials in the capital started blocking Hu's requests for new business licenses. Some of his trade deals were mysteriously stalled. A few of his allies found themselves reassigned or demoted. On the surface, it all looked like bad luck. But in Beijing, nothing was ever just coincidence. Xueyan, for his part, didn't immediately react. He was used to friction. He saw the results would speak for themselves. His silk factories were booming, his banks were still solid, and his support for national defense had never wavered. But he underestimated just how personal politics had become. Behind the curtains, Cixi Taiho had begun to suspect that her grip was slipping. Reformers were making too much noise, and Hu's empire was a little too visible. After all, here was a man with no noble title, no military background, no royal blood, just a merchant who could make or break regional governors with a letter of credit. It didn't help that Hu's public image was glowing. Stories about his generosity circulated everywhere, how he paid for disaster relief, funded schools, and hired hundreds of struggling families in his silk mills. But even good press can be dangerous when it makes emperors and empresses feel replaceable. Then came a subtle but chilling signal. A few of Hu Xueyan's petitions to the court went unanswered. For someone in his position, that silence was louder than any decree. It was like knocking on the palace door and realizing it had been bolted shut from the inside. And just like that, the wind started to shift. People who used to rush to partner with him suddenly pulled back. His bankers hesitated. Officials who once called him brother began addressing him more formally or not at all. It was the kind of chill that doesn't come from the weather. But Hu, ever the optimist, kept pushing forward. He doubled down on the projects he believed in: better trade routes, stronger local economies, and military logistics. He still believed that doing the right thing, serving the country, backing the reformers would protect him. What he didn't see was the old court system preparing to remind him of a very old lesson. In imperial China, being right doesn't always mean being safe. From a distance, everything still looked perfect. Hu Xueyan's mansions were lit with lanterns each night. His bank still buzzed with activity, and his name still carried weight across the provinces. But under the surface, something had changed. The silk was still smooth, but the threads were beginning to fray. Whispers had turned into murmurs, and murmurs into rumors. The court was no longer just quietly suspicious, it was passively hostile. And in a system built on favors and face, passive hostility was the first sign of active danger. Hu Xueyan could feel it, but he wasn't sure where it would come from first. Spoiler, it came from the silk. Silk had always been Hu Xueyan's anchor. He'd built his fortune on it, revolutionized its trade, and turned Hangzhou into a textile powerhouse. His silk wasn't just clothing, it was currency, diplomacy, even political theater. Court officials wore it. Foreign envoys admired it. It was luxury with a made in China label before that even meant anything. But now it became his liability. The silk market began to wobble. Foreign demand was unpredictable. Prices dropped. A few key shipments were delayed, then cancelled. At first, Hu Xueyan blamed weather, shipping routes, even global instability. But something deeper was at play. His rivals were working behind the scenes, poking holes in his network. And while the markets wobbled, his enemies sharpened their knives. See, Hu Xueyan didn't just run factories and banks, he also lent money, a lot of money, to local officials, to military units, to provincial governments. But when those same people saw the tides turning against him, they stopped repaying quietly, conveniently. And what could he do? Sue a provincial governor? Send thugs after a general? Not in a Confucian bureaucracy where hierarchy trumped contracts. Then came the real punch. His largest loan-backed venture, a massive silk export deal financed by his bank, went belly up. Not because the silk was bad, but because the partners, some foreign, some domestic, walked away. Some claimed shipping issues. Others lost the paperwork. All of it smelled like sabotage, but Hu Xueyan had no proof. To plug the hole, he moved funds from other projects, then more and more. Soon, the man who once funded armies and built banks was scrambling to cover loans like a shopkeeper juggling IOUs. And still, the court said nothing. That silence? It was their version of watching him drown, without offering a rope. At this point, friends became scarce. Even Zongtang, still fighting wars in the northwest, couldn't help. His hands were full, and besides there were whispers in the palace that protecting Xueyan might not be worth the risk anymore. What made it worse was that Xueyan wasn't just losing money, he was losing position. Invitations stopped arriving. Audiences with high officials were delayed or denied. His trademark, red-topped hat, once a symbol of his official favor, now felt like a scarlet letter. But here's the thing. Xueyan didn't panic, at least not outwardly. He kept showing up to meetings, kept paying his staff, kept dressing in the same calm, composed way. That's the kind of man he was. If he was going down wearing silk. Yet behind closed doors, even he began to ask, did I back the wrong side? Because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about politics. The internal war between conservative and reformist factions had turned hot, and Xueyan, by virtue of his ties to Zongtang and his independence from foreign banking powers, had painted himself into a corner. The reformers were losing influence. Cixi Taiho's conservative faction was consolidating power. Li Hongzhang's connections with foreign banks were now preferred over Xueyan's homegrown empire. It was as if the entire chessboard had tilted overnight, and Hu was stuck on the wrong side. And then came the reports quiet. Anonymous reports submitted to the court. Allegations of corruption, misuse of funds, overreach, no proof, just enough smoke to make fire believable. In the Qing system, you didn't need evidence. Just enough suspicion, and the weight of your rank could be crushed like a fly under a jade stamp. So, as 1878 loomed, Xueyan stood in his mansion, watching the lights of Hangzhou flicker outside, knowing full well the empire he helped save was starting to let go of his hand. And maybe, just maybe, it had never really held it at all. It's a strange thing how silence can feel louder than thunder. By the start of 1879, Xueyan's world had grown eerily quiet. No more urgent letters from generals. No more flattering invitations from ministers. Even the messengers, who used to arrive breathless with court errands, seemed to have forgotten his address. He wasn't officially under investigation. He hadn't been stripped of his rank. And yet, everyone could feel it. The empire was backing away, one silent step at a time. But that's the cruel elegance of Qing dynasty politics. You didn't always get dragged down in chains. Sometimes, they just pulled the floor out from beneath you and watched to see how long you'd fall. Behind the scenes, Li Hongzhang had made his move. As a powerful viceroy and one of Cixi Taiho's most trusted allies, Li wasn't a man who raised his voice. He didn't have to. He simply offered alternatives, foreign banks, new deals, smoother diplomacy. Where Xueyan represented a self-sufficient China, Li offered one that played nice with the West. The court preferred the latter. It was cleaner, easier to control. And Li wasn't alone. A network of ministers, bureaucrats, and opportunists, many of whom owed Hu favors, chose now to repay him with distance. They saw which way the wind was blowing and adjusted their sails. That's how survival worked in imperial China. Loyalty came second, self-preservation always came first. Meanwhile, Xueyan was bleeding cash. His banks were under pressure from foreign competitors. His loans, some of which were never meant to be repaid, remained unpaid. His customers, nervous about the whispers surrounding him, began pooling their deposits. Slowly at first, then in droves. There's a term for this now, a bank run. Back then, it was simply chaos. Panicked crowds gathered outside his financial offices, demanding their silver. Clerks wept openly as safes were emptied. Hu himself tried to restore calm, promising repayments, calling in favors, offering property as collateral, but the more he tried to slow the collapse, the faster it moved. It was a financial avalanche, and he was trapped in the middle of it. Yet the most brutal blow wasn't the silver lost, it was the silence that followed. Not one court official stepped in, no orders to protect the bank, no emergency decrees to stabilize his assets, not even a public word of sympathy. He was alone. Even the common people, who once called him a living bodhisattva for his charity work, began to turn. Markets thrive on trust, and now that trust had cracked. It didn't matter how many mouths he'd fed, how many scholars he'd sponsored, or how many schools he'd built. In a system this brittle, one bad rumor outweighed 10 years of generosity. And all of it, every ounce of pressure, was engineered, not with force, but with precision. Some of the merchants backing Li Hongzhang's financial networks began to openly undercut Hu's bank. Foreign lenders offered urgent support to provinces on the condition they avoid doing business with Hu Xueyan. It was a quiet coup in silk robes and banknotes. Behind it all, Ciji Taiho said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence had already done its job. By summer, Hu's silk factories were operating at half capacity. The Fuzhou arsenal, once a symbol of reform, was running out of supplies. His pharmacies, yes, he even tried to modernize medicine, were closing one by one. He'd built an empire, but he'd built it on the assumption that the state would protect what served its interests. And now, the state had moved on. Still, Hu Xueyan didn't rage, didn't beg. He wore his usual robes, spoke calmly, and went to work each day like nothing had changed. There was a strange nobility in it, like a captain rearranging furniture on a sinking ship. Some say he truly believed things would bounce back, that logic and merit would eventually win, that the court would see reason. But imperial courts don't work on reason, they work on alliances. And his alliance left untouched for too long had become radioactive. The lesson, bitter and sharp, was settling in. In the Qing dynasty, you could serve the empire with everything you had. You could fund its armies, feed its people, and protect its sovereignty. But the moment you became inconvenient, it would let you burn. By the time 1880 rolled around, Hu Xueyan's empire looked like a mansion with golden doors and collapsing beams. From the outside, he was still China's richest man. He still wore silk robes with subtle embroidery. He still carried himself with calm dignity. But anyone paying attention could see the cracks were now wide enough to swallow the very floor beneath his feet. His financial empire was hollowed out. His political protection vanished. His social reputation fading. And worst of all, his most reliable patron Zongtang was now too far away, both physically and politically, to help. Left without options, Hu Xueyan tried one last move, a desperate refinancing effort. He approached a network of Chinese merchants and even a few cautious foreign partners, hoping to stitch together a rescue package. The idea was simple. If he could stabilize just one leg of his operations, maybe the bank, maybe the silk exports, he could rebuild from there. But the old charm didn't work anymore. Every handshake he extended came back cold. Some merchants politely declined. Others claimed to be waiting for Beijing's opinion. A few simply disappeared. And those who might have helped were warned quietly but firmly that supporting Hu Xueyan could be seen as challenging the court's will. In other words, suicide. This was no longer about business. It was about optics. Helping Hu now meant taking sides, and no one in their right mind wanted to side with a man already halfway buried. And then came the official blow. One morning, without warning or hearing, Hu Xueyan's civil title was revoked, just gone. No ceremony, no explanation. One day, he was a red-topped merchant official. The next, he was just another businessman. But in the Qing Dynasty, that hat wasn't just decoration, it was armor. It granted protection, opened doors, offered immunity. Without it, you were exposed. Anyone could sue you, investigate you, strip you down to nothing. And someone did exactly that. Within weeks, the Ministry of Revenue launched a formal investigation into Hu Xueyan's finances. They accused him of mismanaging funds, failing to repay loans, and ironically, endangering national financial stability. Never mind that he had been the one propping it up for years. Now, they blamed him for the collapse he never truly caused. It was like charging the firefighter with arson after the house burned down. Still, Hu faced the Inquisition with calm. He offered records, receipts, witnesses. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. Some say he even smiled, like a man watching a movie he already knew the ending to, because he understood this wasn't a trial. It was an execution wrapped in red tape. And when the verdict came, it was swift. All assets to be seized. His banks closed. His properties confiscated. His remaining titles stripped. Everything he had built, every coin, every building, every thread of silk was no longer his. His life's work had been unmade by the very hands he once fed. Friends vanished. Former allies refused to speak his name. His household staff, once numbering in the hundreds, dwindled to a handful of loyal servants. His grand Hangzhou residence grew quiet, the halls once filled with guests now echoing with emptiness. But here's the part that still haunts people. Hu Xueyan never fled. He could have. He had connections. He had escape routes. He could have gone south, disappeared into the countryside, or even sought protection from foreign consulates. But he didn't. He stayed in Hangzhou, in his city, among his people. Some say it was pride. Others say it was exhaustion. But maybe, just maybe, he believed that walking away from everything would have been a greater failure than losing it all. He had spent decades believing in the system, its rules, its rewards, its hierarchy. And now, as it turned on him, he chose to face it head-on, stripped of power, but not of dignity. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was just trying to end things on his own terms. And quietly, under the surface, a different kind of legacy was beginning to form, one that no court decree could erase. The year was 1881. Hu Xueyan was now, officially, a man without a title, without fortune, and most painfully, without purpose. The empire he once bankrolled had erased him as cleanly as a name scraped from a stone tablet. He still lived, yes, but in the eyes of the court, he no longer existed. He spent his final months in quiet retreat at his Hangzhou residence, though residence might be too grand a word by that point. The gardens had gone wild, the fountains were dry. The once bustling corridors, where merchants and ministers once mingled, now echoed with the soft, shuffling footsteps of a man wandering through memories. He didn't drink. He didn't curse the heavens. He didn't even write memoirs. Instead, he spent most of his days reading. Books on history, on governance, on medicine. He had always loved the idea of systems, how things worked, how pieces fit. That's what made him such a brilliant businessman. But now, he was studying a different kind of failure, the kind that didn't appear in balance sheets. People who visited him during those final days said he was surprisingly serene. One scholar who dared to ask him how he felt about the collapse said Hu responded with a soft laugh. The emperor needs enemies more than friends. You cannot feed both the court and your own soul forever. It was a sentence that stuck, not bitter, not self-pitying, just clear-eyed, like a man who had finally understood the rules of the game after he lost it. And maybe that's what makes Hu Xueyan's story so unforgettable, not just the rise, not just the fall, but the way he accepted both. He had tried to do the impossible, to serve the country and still survive as a private citizen, to swim with tigers and not get eaten. But in a system built on loyalty to the throne, personal brilliance was always suspect. And Hu was too brilliant, too visible, too useful until he wasn't. His passing was quiet. No state funeral, no official obituary, just a modest ceremony in Hangzhou, attended by a few loyal friends and former staff. The man who once dined with governors and advised the generals was laid to rest like an ordinary citizen. But something strange happened in the years that followed. People began to talk, not loudly, not in official circles, but in tea houses, in merchant homes, in student gatherings. They told stories about the banker who had funded a war when the emperor wouldn't, about the merchant who had built schools and hospitals before the court even thought to, about the man who had believed that China could stand on its own 2 feet, without bowing to foreign banks or begging for favors. In a strange twist of irony, the more the court tried to erase him, the larger he loomed in memory, and then came the imitators. New businessmen emerged who claimed inspiration from Hu Xueyan. They studied his methods, quoted his lines, and tried to follow his blend of social responsibility and smart investment. His pharmacies, long shuttered, became case studies for modern medicine in China. His ideas about banking independence became fuel for later reformers. He had failed, yes, but he had also planted seeds. Seeds that would take root decades later, when China began to reimagine what it meant to build wealth not just for oneself, but for a nation. The story of Hu Xueyan isn't just a cautionary tale about flying too close to the Sunday. It's also a quiet rebellion against the idea that one must always choose between country and conscience, between loyalty and logic. And in that sense, maybe he didn't lose after all. Because even in his downfall, he proved that you could try that even in an empire of rules and robes and rituals, there was room, however briefly, for a man who simply wanted to help build something better. As China limped toward the end of the 19th century, struggling with internal decay and external pressure, the story of Hu Xueyan took on a kind of ghostly presence. He wasn't mentioned in official histories, at least not favorably, but his name floated through conversations like an unresolved chord, a warning, a memory, a question: what had gone so wrong? To many reformers who came after him, the answer was brutally simple. Xueyan trusted the empire too much. He believed that by serving the state, by backing its generals, funding its wars, and protecting its sovereignty, he would earn protection in return. But in the Qing court, loyalty was transactional. The moment your usefulness ended, so did your value. And in Hu's case, that moment came not when he failed, but when he succeeded too much. That success made him a threat, not because he wanted power, but because he didn't. He showed that it was possible to move mountains without a noble title, to fund armies without kneeling at court, to shape policy without being in politics. And that, to the old elite, was deeply unsettling. They could handle corrupt officials. They could handle greedy merchants. But a businessman with vision, principles, and a reputation, that was dangerous. The court couldn't control Xueyan, so it destroyed him. But the real betrayal, the one that still echoes today, wasn't just political, it was personal. Because the truth is, Xueyan had never played both sides. He had always been loyal to Zongtang, loyal to the idea of a stronger, more self-reliant China, loyal even to a court that ultimately abandoned him. And it's this loyalty that gives his fall such weight. He didn't lose because he schemed. He lost because he believed. There's something deeply human in that. In the years following his death, China plunged deeper into crisis. Foreign powers carved up ports. Rebellions flared. The Qing dynasty clung to survival with brittle fingers. And in all of that chaos, the story of Xueyan lingered like smoke in a sealed room. You'd hear his name in whispers, from a banker in Shanghai referencing his models, from a reform-minded official lamenting how the court treats its most loyal servants, from a student wondering aloud if China had crushed one of its best hopes too soon. And there's another bitter irony. Many of the same officials who had helped ruin Xueyan's empire would later come begging for help from foreign banks. They borrowed at terrible rates. They surrendered key trade ports as collateral. They did exactly what Hu had tried to prevent. In the end, they got their money, but at the cost of sovereignty. Xueyan had offered another way. A flawed way, maybe, but a proud, local, independent way. And the empire had chosen to throw it away like a broken tool. Looking back, some historians call Hu a tragic figure. Others call him a fool for trusting power. Still others see him as a proto-reformer, a man ahead of his time, trying to modernize China without sacrificing its soul. But maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. He was a man who lived through contradiction, merchant and patriot, insider and outsider, celebrated and erased. And through it all, he never stopped believing in the idea that China could stand tall on its own, without begging, without bowing. That belief cost him everything. And yet, it also ensured he would never be forgotten. The final pages of Xueyan's life are not written in ink, but in quiet absence. No statues, no grand tomb, no school named in his honor. For a man once considered the richest and the most influential businessman in all of China, his exit was more of a vanishing act than a curtain call. And yet, the silence he left behind said more than 1,000 scrolls could. In the years following his downfall, the Qing dynasty would continue its slow crumble. The very same court that turned its back on him struggled to manage rebellions, foreign pressure, and a modern world it could neither understand nor control. The same ministers who had once criticized Hu for being too ambitious would go on to borrow shamelessly from foreign powers, selling off land, influence, and even dignity. And for what? Temporary stability, fragile peace, loans with impossible strings attached. Ironically, the very things Hu Xueyan tried to protect China from the loss of financial independence, the grip of foreign bankers, the hollowing of native industries, were exactly what swallowed the dynasty he had tried to serve. In many ways, his story became a mirror, a caution, a question. What happens when a nation devours its most loyal servants? It's tempting to look at Hu's fall as a single man's tragedy. But that would be too easy. His story is bigger than one person. It's the story of a system that could not tolerate those who walked the line between old and new. A system that feared change more than collapse. And yet, there's something almost defiant about the way Hu Xueyan lived. He never tried to become emperor, never led a rebellion, never betrayed the throne. His revolution was quieter, funding arsenals, educating the poor, building systems that worked better than the ones approved by the court. He wasn't asking for the empire to change overnight. He was just showing that it could, that maybe scare them most of all. But history has a long memory, and despite the court's efforts to bury him, Hu Xueyan has refused to stay buried. Today, tourists still visit the remains of his residence in Hangzhou. His business models are taught in economics courses. His name appears in novels, dramas, and the quiet conversations between generations, and not just as a story of failure. He is remembered as a man who tried, who built, who believed. Not in glory or power, but in something far more fragile. The hope that a private citizen, armed with vision and integrity, could make his country stronger. Even now, more than a century later, his life speaks to something deeply modern, the tension between public duty and personal ambition, between serving the system and being crushed by it, between holding onto principles and surviving the cost. He didn't win, but he did matter, and that might be the most enduring legacy of all. So now, as the lights dim and the night wraps a little tighter around your room, think of Hu Xueyan not just as a name in the past, but as a quiet voice beneath the noise of history. A man who once stood at the crossroads of empire and ambition, who chose loyalty over safety and vision over comfort. Let your mind slow down, like his footsteps through the overgrown paths of his quiet Hangzhou garden. Imagine the gentle rustle of silk robes, the soft tap of shoes on stone, the flicker of lantern light in empty halls once filled with laughter and plans. He didn't ask to be remembered. He simply did what he thought was right until the world changed around him and left him behind. And in that quiet, you can almost hear him breathe again, not as a fallen tycoon, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that building something meaningful often means walking alone. That being forgotten for a time doesn't mean being erased forever. That dignity, in the end, isn't in winning, but in how you stand when you lose. Now, close your eyes. Let Hu Xueyan's story fade gently into the background, like distant bells across West Lake. Let it drift into your dreams, where even the broken things still shine. Good night.